But that's a really good example of what I'm talking about when I say that a Palantir cloud is a must, is that I don't want my engineers writing AWS infrastructure code, because that code has zero value for my organization, and they're likely going to mess it up on some level, because AWS is a really deep platform and you have to be a pretty gnarly subject matter expert to build those reference architectures correctly. So a Palantir cloud would just abstract away all that complexity, and the customer can get the product running in AWS without having to figure out all of the details about the integration and deployment model and all that kind of stuff. And part of that is built into Apollo, right? So like Apollo as a deployment tool abstracts all that complexity away already. So they're already getting some of those similar benefits. But what I want to do is to not have to go to AWS and sign up for that. I want to go to Palantir's website, and all my infrastructure is managed through them, and they're providing the underlying abstraction layer. And that's what the serverless cloud has done. And so far, the developer response has been amazing. Like, I'm on their Slack channel, and I talk with the general manager there, Jeremy Daly. And I'm seeing in real time how much developers are loving this. So I can see like what I'm talking about paying off, and I know that it would pay off for Palantir's customers as well.
Yeah, so from a development point of view, how easy would this be to actually just put out, or of course you have to build it and then distribute it. You're
Yeah.
saying through the work with Apollo, some of this work is already done, or how much
Oh
work
yeah.
would be required to get
What's
something like
great
that
about, so
going?
like Apollo, what they did is they built these little agents that, and this isn't based off of anything that was explained to me as part of sales agreement, and not, it's not, I'm not under NDA to talk about this. But like they created these agents that are purpose built that run in the environment you want to deploy to, and they contain all of the details about how to properly deploy that software within that environment. And that's a really revolutionary breakthrough, because every other CI/CD system tool you're working with today, you're centralizing all the details about how to deploy to an environment, including that like AWS control plane I was talking about before, into your CI/CD build system. And so it's like you have this like sort of Frankenstein monster that is meant to like explain all of the details about um, how you want the software deployed into each of those environments, centralized in this one build system. And that's not scalable. You just can't keep adding to that. Eventually, it starts to collapse under its own weight. And a good example of an implementation like that is Terraform from HashiCorp. So like Terraform is a tool that DevOps people use to abstract away the cloud provider details, but they're not fully abstracted. Like, you still have to put, build spec files and other types of files that truly describe in detail what you might want to be doing within that particular infrastructure. But Terraform is probably the closest thing to like a multi-cloud abstraction layer that you can write in code. Whereas, but again, that's still infrastructure as code, and it's code that has no value, right? Like, there is zero value for my customers in my infrastructure as code.
Okay.
So I don't want my engineers writing that code all day. I would rather them write features, that my users are going to love and drive more value for my company. So Apollo is great because they can take Foundry and deploy it to these environments, and all of the details are already figured out, right? And then if you want to release new models, you want to release new things that Foundry is going to use, you can deploy them through Apollo and actually have visibility to what's happening there in real time. So that's like pretty amazing, in my opinion. It's sort of an application of what we call inversion of control in software engineering, but no one was thinking this way, and they were, which is pretty good indicator that they've got sort of a 0 to 1 move in this space. The other thing that's cool about Apollo is that it runs on anything. I mean, like, you could put Apollo on a camera. You could put, or like the agents that are managing the deployment, and you can put those on cameras. You can put those on your laptop. You can put them in sensors. You can put them in anything, right? So remember when I was telling you before, like the way we approach things today, where we centralize all that knowledge and use a technology like Terraform to try and do multi-cloud. Now imagine you're not just doing multi-cloud. You're doing like multi-network, multi-device, IoT. You've literally got millions of deployment targets. There is no way you can effectively manage that through a centralized CI/CD build system and an abstraction tool like Terraform. It's just not going to work. So Apollo is going to let us scale out to the edge, which includes all of these IoT devices. And it's basically, it includes your laptop, it includes cell networks, edge networks. And that's a game changer, because if the future really is decentralized, we need Apollo. Like, we can't achieve that decentralized future with existing technology like Terraform or traditional build systems.
Yeah, so Palantir, or Carp specifically, is always talking about being 5 years ahead.
Yep.
And I think of their work with Edge AI as kind of pushing, but I was just wondering, what's your take on them claiming that they'll be able to build products 5 years before the world needs them? And what kind of foresight is needed? Also, how have we seen this proven in the past such that they will be able to continue to do it in the future? And is Apollo one of those examples of they were needing to further their platform, distribute the consistent updates to improve both Gotham and Foundry, and that's sort of a byproduct of what they needed to use for the product
Yep.
development that's actually enabling them to um, to do these other initiatives in the future.
Let's go through like a few examples of that thesis, like how they've materialized it, and maybe speculate as to some additional things that are coming that will further bolster that claim, right? So like Apollo obviously is way ahead of the game, right? Because as an engineer, like our companies are really only focused on one platform. Like we deploy to AWS or we deploy to GCP or we deploy to Azure, right? Barely anyone's thinking multi-cloud right now. And the reasons, the practical reasons a company might want to go to multi-cloud is what we call high availability and durability. And these are key components of service level agreements for any software that you're going to build or SaaS platform you're going to sign up for. When you a typical deployment on AWS is a single AWS region in which there are multiple data centers, and your software will run in at least two of those what are known as availability zones. And what that does is provide a certain amount of high availability guarantees that your software will be up and running and won't be down, right? It gives you a certain level of those. I believe there's like 2 nines of guarantees baked into that single region architecture. So it's a 99.99% uptime, right? But that's really not good enough, right? Like, so the only reason we've gotten to that point where we can rely, like to us, it sounds okay to have software running, 99.99% of the time,
Yeah.
is because we haven't relied on it as heavily. Today, the value of software, like you just can't have it go down. Like if it goes down, you're suffering tremendous losses. You may be in violation of law. Like there's all these problems. And so we have to find a way to get outside of a single AWS region. And that takes us to things like multi-region active architectures, which are incredibly complicated to manage, not just from like the build system point of view that Apollo can power, but also from like consistency guarantees and like all these other really complicated things in computer science that are hard to do once your software is running all over the place, right? So them having the foresight to build a build system that would not only get us to multiple AWS regions, but we could actually deploy software across multiple cloud providers, right?
Yeah.
That's software that's always on, right? There's pretty much no way it's going down, right? And why do we need to get there? Well, one of the reasons might be that there's a war, right? So like maybe AWS data centers are getting blown up, like maybe there are other types of disruptions that are attacks on networks. Like AWS has its own networking infrastructure it's built. What happens if those networks are being attacked? Well, your software is gone. Like your customer base is gone tomorrow. As the world prepared, and this is where I think that Alex Karp has publicly stated, the future is going to be a lot more chaotic, a lot more tumultuous. We're going to have events that we need to learn to cope with. And I think one of those things is that the reliability of networks will become questionable. Whereas today we take for granted that they're stable, in the future they're going to be unstable. So Apollo is a leading indicator that they've been thinking about that problem for quite a long time, and that people are going to need to expand the network and get on basically every network they can to keep their software up and running all the time. But that's also forecasting a world where software is way more critical to the business. Like why would you go through all of there's still a lot of complexity we're going to have to manage in making multi-cloud architectures work. We're not there yet. But why would they do it? Why would you want to do it in the first place? And I think that that's the underlying value there, is that there is software that is so essential to the business running that you just can't have it ever go down. And I think that's also where they're the leading indicator, is that they've built ecosystems, that like a whole ecosystem in Foundry that is meant to drive business decision making for a non-technical user in real time, right? And that's the world they're forecasting. Again, it points to a world in which things are a bit more chaotic, that aren't as tranquil maybe as we're used to dealing with today. But I think that that's another leading indicator of Foundry being a complete ecosystem for the non-technical user to run simulations, to make real-time decisions. It's another indicator that they were way ahead of the game. Because right now we're all just figuring out how to put tools together to try and make a data-driven decision, right? By a highly qualified expert, which Google employs most of those people already. Like Google
Yeah.
employs most of the world's AI research scientists and ML scientists. So like just getting those people into your organization to help you do that is going to be challenging. And Palantir, again, being forward thinking, I think has already seen that problem and said, you know what, let's let people who aren't data scientists make data-driven decisions with a platform that enables this sort of augmented intelligence version of data science, right? Where you're trying to make the human operator better, right? You're trying to enhance their data-driven decision, their capabilities to make data-driven decisions. So that's another
Mhm.
leading indicator that they were way ahead of the game, because we're all still sitting here trying to put tools together and like, try to get research scientists to tell us what our data means. But they bypassed that a long time ago. They saw that as an unworkable, unscalable model, right? So that's another example. I think if you look at some of the things that they probably haven't yet shipped, but are probably in the works, crypto, for example, that they're starting to get into. But
Yeah.
I think more generally on the security front, they're 5 years ahead or more.
Very
Particularly Courtney Bowman. He's a civil liberties. He's on their privacy and civil liberties team, and he wrote this really amazing book about ways you can engineer security protocols in a zero trust environment. And I think Palantir generally on the security front, cybersecurity front, is way, way, way ahead of the game. So I think you're going to start seeing more and more products that look a little bit like they're offerings for crypto or the fraud detection systems, but they're made for full application monitoring to detect problems that are security related in your applications. So I think that's also where they're very forward thinking. I mean, just today there was a memo from the federal government about the need for all vendors now to adopt a zero trust policy system for their applications, right? Palantir has been advocating for those protocols for a really long time, like 10 years now. And so like that's another leading indicator that they're just way, way, way out ahead. So yeah, to me, I think we have ample evidence that they've sort of saw the need for a different type of software that we don't currently use today and that we don't know we need yet, but they're building that today, and when we're ready, we're all going to come back to Foundry, I think, and like realize that it's the right platform.
Yeah. So it really sounds like it's trying to forecast the future, like look forward into the future and then make a bet on that future and sort of pull back and say, what can we build today? So it really is a bet on the future. And of course, things could go different, but it sounds like they're trying to build this idea of a decentralized platform, as you're saying. Is that the right take for all these multi-cloud environments?
No, I think it's more like they have a vision of what the world is going to look like, and they've gone backwards from there, right? So like they have a vision for what the state of governments will be, what the state of our institutions will be, what the state of supply chains are going to be, and they've worked backwards to figure out what products do I need for that world that we haven't sort of encountered yet, but we're being propelled towards, right?
Yeah.
And that's also why I think they value privacy and civil liberties so much, is that they know the potential for misuse of in that world, right? So like in a world where everything you do, all the data you have about you is being collected. Let's imagine, for example, this is a good thought experiment of a future they might be thinking about and working back from. Let's say the federal government decides to adopt its own cryptocurrency and ban every other current cryptocurrency, and then get rid of paper money, right? So they don't print any more paper money, they get rid of the paper money supply. Now you're forced into an ecosystem where everything you buy is fully known by the federal government, every single transaction. Is that a world you want to live in? I don't know. Like it's a world we're probably going to encounter on some level. And so they're coming up with solutions to that problem, right? They're trying to figure out like, or products that will help an environment in which more and more of our transactions are on digital money and aren't paper based, right? So like how do you do fraud detection in that environment? How do you still protect civil liberties in an environment like that? But that's an example of like how they'll run a thought experiment from something they see as a potential future and start to think about how their products will be built for that future.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about this idea of Palantir being first and foremost an engineering culture and really not
Yep.
having the marketing expertise and not even wanting that initially as the company was growing. So I think that is clear, even from an outsider's point of view. Carp has said it, the executives have talked about it, but I want to get your take on knowing the product and then seeing how the company is portraying itself. Do you have any thoughts, like just publicly, how they've been marketing, or we've seen some advertising as well? And
Yep.
just from a higher level view, do you think they are marketing effectively? Do you do you think, because I was reached out to by someone who thought that Palantir's even landing page was not done 100% correct and their
Yep.
optimizations to make, but that is back to their focus on the company, which is building and building for the future. So they're fine if they don't optimize, I think, every single one of the sales. But yeah, what's your take on the engineering versus the marketing?
So we need to kind of pull apart a few things that are baked into this question. The first one is just a raw marketing question. Like, is their branding effective? Does it resonate with their customer base? More traditional marketing problems. Like, are they doing the right? Are they in the right marketing channels? Or are they, is their engagement good? All that kind of stuff. So that's more traditional marketing question. The other question that's kind of baked in there is more about this attitude in engineering that I shouldn't have to tell you how awesome my product is, that it should speak for itself, right? Like you as another engineer should understand my stuff's awesome because it is awesome, right? And I shouldn't have to sell that to you. You should want to buy it from me, and that is a real thing in engineering cultures where, there's this, like a lot of tech companies pride themselves on not needing to advertise. It's not just Palantir, like, so I think that organic growth is something that a lot of investors look for when they're investing in tech companies, because they know that if your stuff is good, you won't need to try and actively sell it to people. People are going to come to you and use it, right? So like YouTube doesn't have to go market itself, right? Like it sells itself. It's an awesome platform, right? Facebook used to be more like that, but like apps people want to use don't require robust marketing campaigns behind them. And that's why it's a key metric that a lot of investors look for, is like, if you have to spend all this marketing money to get people to use your software, it's probably not that good. So I think there's that element of engineering culture baked in there. But there's also this element of the culture that's particular to Palantir that's baked into this question, which is like, they're very anti-sales. They're very anti-scaling and like selling your soul to the corporate world, even though they're a publicly traded company. They don't like this idea, because you'll hear Carp's, and I'm getting this from Carp's interviews where he talks about, like, we didn't, for a long time, they didn't want to hire a sales team, and that they don't want to look like every other company out there that's just like a widget manufacturer. Like, they believe that they are a 0-to-1 move, and they don't want to have to like sort of devalue that in some way through this like adoption of a robust sales process and marketing process and all that kind of stuff. So there's like all of those things that are kind of baked into that question. On the general marketing side, no, I don't think their marketing team does a good job of like having marketing that resonates with their customer and has good reach and engagement. Like, just for having gone through the process, like I don't think that's there. I don't think it has to be there, though. On the other side is that I do think eventually customers are going to come running to Foundry because it has a success rate substantially higher than everything else out there. So like,
Yeah.
on some level, I think they're right that they don't need those things. But then again, it's like, the best software doesn't always win. You have a very short window of opportunity to capture the market. And if you blow that because you didn't really understand the lack of maturity of your customers, that maybe they didn't fully understand what you were selling, you could have real problems in the future as other companies sort of build their own Foundry-like applications and then are stuck with them for a while. So it's a very risky thing to not take that sales and marketing seriously and really employ the best people possible to get your reach and engagement and understanding your customer and getting things that are resonating with them. So I think they really do need to pay more attention to that, but I don't think they need to like go so far as to look like some of the companies they don't want to look like. I don't think they should lose that. I think that's a really good thing in their culture, but at the same time, understanding like you don't have forever, so.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that a lot of the marketing is more so for the brand, as you're saying. In the New York Times or whatever, their print advertising, it seems like we work with the government. This is what we can do to transform your organization. So it seems like more branding, brand awareness than necessarily, as you're saying, directly attacking exactly why someone should want to use one organization would want to use Foundry, because I think that's very hard to do in just like a one liner or whatever, because of how different organizations use Foundry differently. But I wanted to sort of switch gears to what you were talking about with the customer or the consumer Foundry adoption in the email as a topic, because it seems to me that Palantir's story from an investor point of view is predicated on the growth from the top line, and that really comes from the increase in customers. So is that what you were talking about with the consumer adoption in what you had sent me, or were you thinking about something else? Because I'm wondering if they say their total addressable market is 6,000 uh, enterprise organizations, and they're at under 200 today, I believe 200 or so, and it's going to take many years at their current growth rate, a decade plus at their current growth rate, to get to that target. Do you think there is an inflection point at which the growth radically increases, or just from your point of view, do you think this is going to be a much more of a steady rise of Foundry, or as you're saying, the future will actually, like, if Foundry becomes so much more useful and that becomes so much more clear over time that it's all going to come in at once? I don't know. What do you what do you think about that?
So, when companies come out with these plans, they you have to realize like business is fluid, right? Like you may have a strategy, but that doesn't mean you stick. That strategy doesn't change in response to the market, right? So like I think that they are going to be pressured to have to compete with companies that are growing their customer count at 10 times the rate they are, and that's going to force them to reevaluate that they only need to be in this like global 2000 market, right?
Yeah.
And the reason is that those things that are happening down market can sometimes shape forces happening way up here in what you're doing, right? Think Salesforce, for example. So like when Salesforce competed directly with SAP back in the day, right? SAP was the enterprise CRM, right? So like, but it was really hard to install. It was really hard to maintain, right? It may have some of the characteristics that look like a lot like a Foundry install, where Salesforce, you could just install it and get it up and running, and it was really easy to use, and people loved that. Which also have, Foundry maps onto a lot of those benefits as well, right? But like because Salesforce was able to create this new product that was easy to get up and running with, they have 100,000 customers today, and SAP absolutely has to consider them, like as they shape their future products, and it will shape the way users expect to be able to use software, right? So like my forecast of why that growth model they've put out is wrong and why they're going to have to change directions is directly in response to competition that's offering a product in which there is no upfront sales, in which there is no, you could think like a C3 AI or something that is going to, which is an inferior product by all measures that I can see.
Yeah.
But it's not going to matter if they start making inroads where you just look like this legacy enterprise system that's really hard to incorporate and integrate. So like I think that strategy is going to have to shift. And I think the right model is a Salesforce model, like in terms of customer count and growth, average customer spend, all of that. So like Salesforce, I think, has close to 400 customers that have multi-million-dollar spends with them. But they also have over 100,000 customers, the bulk of which spend several $1,000s, right? So like I think that's the right model for growth and sort of the right adoption, especially because the people who use Salesforce are also going to find a lot of value in Foundry. And Foundry can integrate with those CRM systems to do things like real-time inferences when you're on the phone with a potential lead or in a chat, right? To help direct the conversation and enrich that stream with some additional context about what that customer might really be saying, right? So like Foundry can actually help a lot of these CRM systems and sales systems to be better, right? As we incorporate ML and AI into those systems. So to me, Salesforce is the right way to look at that of where they're going to wind up. But yeah, so it's in terms of like me saying that they're going to 10x some point after 2025, I'm still thinking B2B is the main driver there. Thinking the target customer count should be 100,000, though, not 6,000, right? More in line with the people that use Salesforce today. On the consumer side, this is where I think developers are going to build the value. And I try to point to use cases where Foundry is extremely advantageous for a consumer product. And so and this is a bit like I gave JG the analogy of skateboarding, right? Like skateboarders have figured out a way to use architecture that the original architects never intended, right? So like that's pretty incredible what people can come up with when you give them a set of paints. What can they make with this set of paints? You can make the Sistine Chapel, or you can make something that is not the Sistine Chapel, right? So like I think the developers are going to build that future value empowered by the creativity. And I put out a video yesterday about how you could build a decentralized financial exchange, like a financial data exchange, to help VCs find the next awesome startup, right? Without exchanging any data, right? So, and that can all be powered by Foundry and Apollo. And it's people like me who are going to come up with consumer applications that are well suited for what they're selling and can build that value that are going to deliver those customer applications. And that's really where I see it going. I don't see Palantir building that value. I see developers like me building that value on Foundry, right? And using Apollo, especially in a decentralized future.
Yeah. So on that data, because you had mentioned this as well, your point of view is that Palantir not only doesn't need the data, but doesn't want the data. Now
Yeah, exactly.
we'll move past the misunderstanding that Palantir actually has the data, because that's the first step is understanding that is not how they operate. But there is a argument that having the data is useful in terms of training or whatever, having a supervised. I'm not entirely sure on the technical side of it, but what's your point of view on not even needing the data to succeed?
So this is another question where we got to unpack it to understand it, right? So like, first, let's just kind of go with the traditional reason that investors have really valued companies that have data. And that's generally been for consumer applications that rely heavily on advertising, right? So like, that's why companies that have data, we say things like data is the new oil. Well, the main thing driving the value for that oil is engagement and advertising, right? So like we use that, consumer products use that data to keep you more engaged on the platform so that you see more ads. That's the value driver, right? So like, and Karp refers to that as a cancer, by the way. Like, I don't know if you've seen his interviews where he refers to that model as like a cancer on society, but he's absolutely right. And it is driving really bad behavior, especially in young people. There is a Jonathan Haidt is a American psychologist, and he's done a lot of research into the harmful effects of social media and into these constant, always-on platforms, especially in young girls. And that was the subject of a movie that was put out relatively recently. I think it's called The Social Dilemma, right? And he's in that movie as well. So it's really questionable whether those traditional value propositions are going to be sustainable in the face of regulation. Everyone's worried about crypto regulation killing Coinbase. I'd be more worried about consumer data regulation killing Facebook and killing Google than anything else. So we really need to. So that's the main. Let's unpack that point and set it aside and realize that is not a sustainable strategy. The other is that what is data used for in the context of data-driven decision making? And yes, we need data to train models, but what we have to realize is no one's starting from scratch typically on a model anymore. You get a base model that's already been trained on public data sets or used in some other environment, and then you tune that model to your specific data set, your domain. Now, if I'm Palantir and I'm building a partnership with Hyundai Heavy Industries specifically to sell to all of the people that work in similar domains, I can reuse those base models without ever needing your data. So maybe I've trained it on the base models that are relevant to that industry on one data set. They're still relevant when I go to customer B over here. I can take that base model and put it into the archetypes feature of Foundry and then retrain it on the customer's data over here. and that's hugely valuable, right? So models are portable. Think of models as like a bunch of finely tuned weights that tell you about the neat interactions between data, but you don't need, once you have that tuning done, you can take it with you. You don't need the data to take it with you. Okay, so like I think that's what people sort of don't understand, is that the base models and all the machinery to make the base models, which include things like feature engineering, is way more valuable. It is true that most of the man hours that go into a data science project are around like data labeling problems and getting your data ready for actual training. When you're going to like tune those base models, most of the time is spent in that, but that's largely been outsourced to things like Mechanical Turk and to these other companies that just specialize in data labeling. That's all they're doing. So,
Okay.
you know, they literally don't need the data. They don't need to do the mundane work of data labeling. They can outsource that. What they really want are the feature engineering tools and base models that are applicable across a whole industry. But that's what they're getting in these partnerships, I'm assuming. I'm assuming that when they write these partnerships, part of the IP agreement is that they can take the base models without the customer data and reuse those in their archetypes and reuse those for future customers. I think that's where they're going to get a lot of downstream effects.
Yeah, so what do you think about all of these announcements of partnerships? You mentioned one, Hyundai Heavy Industries, where these aren't just contracts, they're partnerships where they're working together, both of these organizations, and there might be a little bit of a payment towards Palantir, but more so they're trying to develop a platform. And yeah, that's interesting from an investor point of view, where it seems like there's a lot of work going on, but not necessarily a lot of revenue coming in. And
Yeah.
am I missing something there?
No, I think that this is another example of where they're 5 years ahead, really. So, like, if I have a thesis that in 5 years, businesses can't be as siloed today in the way they work. And what I mean by that is like every business today, even though they have a consortium and a network that they leverage, their data is siloed, right? They all have their own copy of the data. They all have their own version of the code that's sort of running it within their silo to manage their supply chains or whatever. I think what Palantir has figured out is like that model is going to be disaggregated and distributed in the future. And why is that? Well, let's say I want to guarantee that nothing in your supply chain was produced from slave labor in China to comply with federal law,
Yeah.
or that none of your parts come from China because we're at war with China, right? So like, or a Chinese affiliate. I can't trust your data silo for that because any admin in your organization can change that data at any point and hide the sourcing of a part, right? So like I need something like a blockchain that will guarantee that the data is accurate through consensus. And I think that Palantir is forecasting a consortium in the future where those guarantees are going to be necessary. They're not going to be optional. And by building these partnerships, they're laying the foundation for building business consortiums that can disaggregate, decentralize, and take advantage of these consensus models to prove data is correct and accurate, right? So like, I think it's just another example of where they're way ahead and they're trying to build consortiums. They're not trying to build one-offs, like a one-off install. At least that's my theory on it and why they are so focused on partnerships and across industry verticals or across industries. But it could also just be an easy sales strategy too. Having there's a lot of benefit into building a solution for one customer that's generally applicable across a bunch of customers, right? So like if I build, and I have a lot of experience with this as a former Adobe solutions provider, we could build a custom web to print solution for you making greeting cards. That same web print solution can power coffee mugs and t-shirts and anything else you want, right? So we don't have the associated templates maybe right away, but we have all the underlying machinery to make all that work, right? So like there's just a lot of benefits to building something once and then generally applying that to all people who are in a similar industry.
It seemed like what they're doing with Skywise as an ecosystem is a further evolution of the Foundry platform. Is that what you mean by Foundry as an ecosystem? The idea of, let's say it's an airline manufacturer like Airbus, then using Foundry for an airline itself, and there's a network effect there, a degree of separation, if you will. Is that what you're thinking about on the ecosystem side, or is it something else?
It's part of it. It's the ecosystem side is like within a particular industry, there's generally preferred best practice, right? So like within, let's just say that you're in the airline business and you make software, you have, engineering teams that build software for that business. There's generally agreed upon best practice as the sort of right workflows, right? Because remember, software is just a set of instructions, right? We're writing down a list of instructions. It's like write an instruction set for you taking a shower, right? Like it literally, that's all software really is doing. It's codifying instructions on what to do. There's generally best practice workflows that are widely adopted within mature industries already, right? On the best way to order parts, for example, or the best way to certify inspections and all of these various things. And they're usually codified in software, right? There's some system somewhere that someone's using to verify all these workflows, right? And to record them and to, in some cases, automate some of it. So when you have an opinionated way of doing business with an unopinionated way to build software, you get what's called a train wreck, right? So like, right? So engineers will introduce all their own interpretations about how to build code that works within these really well-defined and established workflows that are just wrong and incorrect. And the only and because these systems are complex, meaning that you can't reason about any software system of any size whatsoever. They're literally in the category of complex systems. The only way you effed up is to interact with the system. So this is a really expensive error when engineers do this to your business.
Mm.
The only way you found out that they did something wrong is that you create a bug report, or you tell them, no, this feature needs to be rewritten to do this, right? Or what do you mean you built it with all this open source tools and now we have npm activism where people are purposely breaking your open source libraries? We can't do that anymore. Okay. There are all these decisions that engineers are making that are high cost, high probability of failure for the business. And that's what happens when you have you create your own ecosystem in which the workflows are opinionated, but the engineering processes are unopinionated. Foundry has an opinion about how you build software for that ecosystem, right? So it's not like your engineering team is just going to come in there and do whatever it wants. It's going to engineer software in a certain way. It's going to be deployed in a certain way. It's going to be managed and operationalized in a certain way. And that's all going to be to support the underlying business, right? That's the right way to build software generally. And that's what I mean by the ecosystem, is that, there is an approach that Palantir advocates for and is codified into Foundry and all of its product suite of how you should operate. And they're learning more about that in every industry that they expand to. And what's amazing about their success rate here that people are like kind of overlooking is like, these are all high stakes industries that are incredibly hard to execute well in and make that ecosystem work to where people actually want to work within it and not actively fight against it. So to me, that's just like they're crushing it in their ability to do this and to build software systems that deliver actual value for the people that use them within an opinionated ecosystem that won't produce train wrecks. So like that's what I mean by the ecosystem, and that's what I see the value in the things they're doing with like Skywise, and that I'm sure we're going to see equivalents released here very soon for other industries.
Okay. So it's more of a technical point of view on the idea of an ecosystem. All right, gotcha.
Yeah, I
So
mean, keep in mind, like I'm in the man, like I'm in the management side too. So like I build technology, but I also deal with executives, and so like that's why there's a lot of friction between those two things in most cases, right? So like actually finding a way to make those things mesh is where a lot of innovation happens, and it is hard to do, right? So like that high friction mesh, you don't want friction between engineering and business. You want a handshake or unification, and I think that's where all the good things happen when you're a technology company, and you can do that, but it's also very hard to do.
yeah, gotcha. That's interesting. I think, yeah. So like on the opinionated versus unopinionated point of view, do you think Palantir is set up in a good way in terms of the engineering culture, and then Carp sort of saying, this is where we want to go.
Yep.
This is what we want to build. Do you see that as a good setup? Because
I think
Carp
anyone
is
can
saying how
see.
difficult it is to run an organization like this.
I think anyone can see that. Yeah. If you read, so they have a Medium blog where their engineers write about what they're building and their experiences at Palantir. And it's amazing. Like just read what the engineers are saying about Palantir publicly, and then you can try and infer things from what you hear in the industry, right? So like I hear generally really good things from people that have either applied at Palantir or worked for Palantir that I've spoken to. So I'm pretty certain it's not BS, you know, when I read their blog and I kind of and I talk to their engineers in the comments sections or speak with people I know who've worked there or have applied there. Um, so yeah, I think that they're doing a very good job of building this culture of just a kick-ass engineering team. You know, like, and they've already gone through the scale phase pretty much. So like, there's this phase that most startups are in for a really long time where you can kind of have tribal knowledge about how a system works, and you don't need like really good processes to scale that. You can review every pull request, you can be involved in every aspect of the product across your organization. But once you get to like 100 engineers or so, that doesn't work anymore. Your teams will produce more poorly if you continue with that model. And this is where operationalizing software engineering becomes the major challenge. And it's been the subject of a lot of books. There's like in the software engineering business, we read these books and we see how Google did it. We see how Netflix did it. You know, like we're generally good copycats. I know that I'm generally a copycat. I do make innovation on my own, small improvements, but we're standing on the shoulder of giants. But what's funny about that is you really can't learn how to incorporate those lessons that you've read about until you actually experience it. It's really like a theory versus life thing. You know, like people tell you like you can't learn everything from books, right? It's totally true. Like when you go through this scale phase, it's like there's just no way, because every organization is different. You're going to have to find a way to apply those lessons within your company and what works for you. But software engineering at scale is a massive challenge, and that's where a lot of innovation happens. How do you get 500 engineers to contribute to a single code base? It's a pretty big problem. And so, you know, but they've passed through that gate already, and reading the work they've done, it's really inspirational. I've taken some of it to try and solve problems that I have, right? But they are in a elite category of companies that have passed through that phase transition for sure.
So one thing that Dave Lee had mentioned, or not mentioned, but when I was speaking with him, it became clear from a strategy point of view or a mission point of view that there is a difference between what they're doing with Gotham and what they're doing with Foundry. And it reminded me of something I talked about with Chris Patel, which was his idea of splitting Foundry and Gotham. Now, I don't believe they would ever do this. And by splitting, he meant separating and having two companies instead of one under the same roof. Now, I don't think they would ever do this, but I think it's an interesting idea for the reason of the mission of each of them. Where I think Gotham, the mission is very clear, whereas Foundry, sure, it's a clear mission, but I think there's a lot more that isn't necessarily clear because it's not the sole purpose of the organization. So I think it's an interesting idea. Again, I don't think they would ever do it, but I think it would clear up a lot of the optics from a public perspective. And again, I don't think Palantir would do it just for that, but I think a lot of the misconceptions come from the government side and a lot of, I don't know, just what Ross Gerber was saying. He's kind of misconstruing the two products and platforms. And I think that could be solved if they separated both of them. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on separating either physically or just just mentally the two?
Yeah, and again, this is another one where there's a lot to unpack. So let's kind of look at what's inside this question. I think one, there's just an image problem, right? So like people are nervous about Palantir because they believe they have a PR problem, and it relates directly to their work with like ICE and other government agencies. Okay, if you have paid attention to what the person that runs Gotham has said in like the earnings reports, and I forget the person's name, the gentleman that runs the Gotham side,
Yeah.
but I can hear a lot of frustration in his voice over strategy relating to the consumer segment, and that I think he might leave the company at some point, which would be a big blow for them. And that there are some internal politics playing out that relates to this, because a lot of design decisions about how you build a system that is good for government but then how do you build a system that's good for consumer applications or for, you know, B2B, general B2B enterprise applications? Those design decisions will be in conflict. And if you're building one foundational product and you haven't separated them, you're going to get people essentially competing for resources and decision making. And that's really bad. It's like now you're fighting yourself, right? You're not only fighting the competition, but you're fighting yourself. And so I think there is some truth to that and why you're going to want to separate those two businesses. But sometimes things change. Like today, with this new zero trust mandate from the federal government, a lot of the design decisions you used to have to make are null and void. They're basically, with this new security model, forcing vendors for the government into a model that looks a lot more like a traditional SaaS B2B application with zero trust policies. So, you know, we don't know what the future is going to bring in terms of these forces kind of aligning, you know, and how Foundry and Gotham may end up looking a lot more identical than they are in the future. But I think there's some validity to both of those questions. An image problem related to its work with government agencies that kill people, right? They do valuable work. I'm not saying the work isn't valuable or needed, but they do work that will make people not feel warm and fuzzy about Palantir,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But also that there's this internal conflict in system design in which you can't serve two masters with one team, you know, and one set of resources. You may have to consider dividing those things.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Palantir was founded for, and its initial work was for the government, and they
Yep.
were able to adapt what they were doing for commercial applications as well. So I don't think it's necessarily what they set out to be doing, but they sort of found this other lane. And I don't know, because when Dave had asked me what is the true purpose of Palantir's commercial business, I think from my perspective as someone observing the company from a public point of view, that's not entirely clear because the origin of it was this is the software we're developing and it can be used in this other way. So what comes first really? And
Yeah.
is the I think it makes sense that the government would come first because that's
Yeah.
the thing, but
Well, let me kind of unpack that a little bit more too, because you guys are having insight into something that is actually a little bit more, I think, explainable than maybe you're giving credit for. Is explainable AI is a thing in the industry that's sort of come around in the last few years, but for a long time we've been building like what are called neural networks and black box models that make predictions, but we don't know why they made the prediction, right?
mm,
Like we just are like, model said it's a cat. Well, it's clearly a hot dog. It's not a cat. You know, like why did
yeah,
the model come up to that? I don't know. You know, like whatever. It's really hard to trust a system in which you have no visibility into how a decision was made, and people don't like adopting those kind of systems generally, right? And the thing with AI that no one wants to talk about too is it's a long tail problem, meaning that like there's this category of things that you solve really quick and are great, but then there's this huge long tail of exceptions to that in which the model fails to make accurate predictions. And it's actually like that huge long tail of like all these little edge cases make
yeah,
the thing commercially unviable, you know? And so there's been this big push towards explainable AI, but that started with the DARPA project, right? So like DARPA, when it initially started this AI research project, adopted augmented intelligence as its model. So there will be a human operator that you make better. You will not build black box artificial intelligence, right? We need human operators to make battlefield decisions, right? But we want to make them better. You know, we want to make them faster. And we want to be more accurate. And so Foundry is built around this whole concept, right? And so, but because it came out of DARPA and it came out of the military and intelligence side, it's deeply ingrained into the way Palantir approaches how ML and AI should be used in data-driven decision making, right? And so it was just the first place this was happening. And also that costs associated with doing ML and AI research were so prohibitive that only FANG companies and military, like governments, could invest in it. Like that's another thing people don't realize is like until 2017, there wasn't a way you could do this in a cost-effective way. And really not until 2020 did we have all of the tools through cloud providers that were required to make ML and AI-based decision-making incorporated. there wasn't a cost-effective platform for that. So it basically had to start with the government, right? Like there was no other customer other than, FANG companies, and they were already doing this on their own, and spending ridiculous amounts of money to do it. And which is why the military also was contracting with Google initially with DARPA. So like people need to understand that this used to be extremely cost prohibitive with, you building enormous amounts of infrastructure that underlaid your ability to like layer in these things. And so the evolution is just exactly where it should have been. It had to start with governments for Palantir. For FANG companies, it started with their advertising initiatives. But again, super cost prohibitive. There's no way to do it unless you're in that business, And so pretty much had to start in the military, and then or military and intelligence kind of work its way up into the consumer space. But this is again where they're like 10 years ahead. They're not 5 years ahead. They're like over a decade ahead. They're out in front where Google was. No one knew that Google would what the value of consumer data was. We're just figuring that out today. Google knew what the value of consumer data was 20 years ago. Yeah. So did Palantir. Like they understood the value of data and being able to drive decision making. No one knew that. And we're just now figuring it out. And we're just now adopting all these technologies to help us make data-driven decision. But what's funny is there's an 87% failure rate across all industries to be able to, in ML and AI-based initiatives. Gartner put out a report on this. And there's a lot of things driving that failure rate, but like business, but the little dirty secret is all these companies are adopting like Snowflake, and they're adopting Databricks, they're adopting AWS SageMaker. That those projects are those things enable projects with an 87% failure rate. I'm pretty sure, Palantir's customers don't have an 87% failure rate. In fact, I think they're re-upping basically everyone, so like, this is going to be the thing this is my sales pitch, right? Like this is when I talk about my sales pitch for Palantir is like, you got Alice and Bob, right? Like Bob decides on the DIY solution, and Alice decides, to adopt Foundry. And Alice puts Bob out of business because Bob's stuck pushing elephants around with his DIY solution that's not giving him any insight, while Alice is just mopping the floor with him, And so the real question is, how do you plan to compete with Palantir's customers, right? Like, how are you actually going to compete with people who don't have an 87% failure rate to get any business value out of this, right? So like that's again where the market will drive, I think, their customer count, is that eventually they're going to come back to Palantir. Eventually they're going to realize like, geez, this system I just spent 3 years building cost 3 times what, my product owner said it would cost, delivers 1/3 of the features, and I've got to go through engineering every time I want to ask a different question. That's not where I want to be, But it's going to be a journey. People are going to have to discover this on their own. I've been through the journey a few times now, so like, it's really shaped my opinion and why I invested in Palantir to begin with. But people who haven't been through that journey and are listening to their CTOs or maybe to their engineering team said, hey, we can build it ourselves. When has that ever worked out for you, by the way? Like at what point was getting into some business you're not in a good decision? It never has been. Companies have gone through this over and over and over as new technology comes out, that they decide to try and build it themselves, only to realize we're not in that business. That's exactly what's going to happen, in my opinion, and what's going to drive hundreds of thousands of customers over to Palantir, I hope. Anyway, that's my
yeah. So tell me a little bit about your experience from that point of view, being it's a startup, right? And you actually got to connect with Palantir's Foundry for Builders team to talk about using the product. So from your point of view, as someone that could potentially build your own solution, versus using Palantir if they would let you, and you're saying eventually this is going to be, as is the consensus, I think Foundry for Builders will be open to anyone once they move past this alumni stage. But as someone in that specific situation of saying we could build our own solution, we could use something else, a thinner product, as Karp has said more recently, if I'm getting that interpretation right, or use Foundry. From that perspective, do you have any insight into the thinking behind a decision like that? Or is it more, we're just going to do whatever's easiest, or we're going to do the right thing?
No, I have a lot of insight on the reasons why companies want to build their own platform. So like what I told JG is like, you got a bunch of people who like to build stuff sitting in the middle of data-driven decision making. There's engineers in the title, right? So like, don't be surprised that people who like to build things for a living want to build Rube Goldberg machines to make data-driven decision happen, which is like the most important thing companies are looking at right now. They're the biggest initiatives right now is data-driven decision making. But yeah, you empowered all these people who want to build stuff, right? You didn't so like that's why they opt for that. And also that this is such a new space, you can really stand out amongst your peers getting conference invitations to talk from AWS to talk about how you implemented these things, right? So like there's a lot of prestige to be had right now and to be leading the way in like how we use ML and AI to enable outcomes at my company. That's a big topic because there is no really established best practice that's been widely adopted. I think the best practice that will be widely adopted is Foundry eventually. We'll get there. It just might take a few years of massive failure. And hopefully it doesn't turn the customer base off to ML and AI decision making more generally. But I don't think they're going to have that luxury because the companies that are successful will just be kicking their butt and they're going to need to find a way to compete. But so like the insight into why engineers want to build something should just be obvious because they're engineers. Like that's why, right? So like, but that's why also that, like they need to maybe do a better job of explaining the failure rate and like the sales team and Foundry for builders in particular, because startups are run by people who are pretty incredible. Like just generally, you don't get to that stage unless you have some amazing people who make really good decisions generally, who are smart. They need to do a better way of convincing those people that you are not going to get around math. The math isn't lying here. Like you have basically a 9 in 10 chance of failing at whatever it is you're trying to do related to this. So let us help you not fail. Like they need to somehow frame that to people who are very confident that they're not going to fail. Right? If you're in a startup, there's only 2 emotions you ever experience, right? It's like absolute joy or just incredible fear, right? Like you're going 100 miles an hour at a brick wall and you're betting that brick wall is going to blink. Like the brick wall is going to move, man. Like that's the kind of mentality you have to run a successful startup. So they're going to have to find a way, I think, with Foundry for builders in particular, to like get around that. And one of the ways you do that too is to get it in the hands of the engineers without an upfront sales process. Build a developer community where these people can learn what the tool does and learn best practice and learn the ecosystem, and they'll advocate it. They'll do the advocating for you. You won't have to do that anymore. But because it's a black box, no one really knows what's in it and they don't know how to use it. They're also, I think, as an engineer at a startup, turned off by it, because they want to know how shit works before they bring it in and adopt it, right? They want some experience with it. They want to look under the covers. They want to make sure that you're not just selling them marketing fluff. Engineers are highly skeptical. Like Karp says that in this, he said that in an interview. Like, if you say your software is great, the first thing I'm going to think is it's not great, right? You need to prove to me it's great. And the way you do that is build a developer community. So like, I think that's what's missing right now from Foundry for builders and the pitch and sort of how they're positioning it. And that's how they could, in startups in particular, win that build versus buy debate. But I don't think just showcasing the features in Foundry, which are amazing, is going to win, right? So, and for the reasons I just laid out, I don't think that will be a resonating pitch. It also probably won't matter because in 3 years after all these initiatives fail, businesses that adopted Foundry are going to be doing well. And the businesses that didn't adopt Foundry who failed, they're going to be going like, why don't we just adopt Foundry? So like, yeah.
Yeah, so 3 things there. The first of which, and correct me if I'm wrong on the interpretation here, but it seems like there's a catch-22 as you laid out from the sales pitch, which
Yep.
is the engineers that would be the ones to understand the product. They understand it, but they then want to build it themselves. Whereas the non-technical management of an organization just can't even understand it to begin with. So
Yep.
is that right? And it seems like Palantir's marketing and sales really needs to be focused on the non-technical, the management,
Yeah.
regardless of if they're
I agree.
non-technical or
I
technical.
agree. I
But
think that's where you win, because that's how it's happened in the past too. Is like as companies were building their own web applications in the past and not using SaaS. So like, think all these SaaS products we have now. Like at my company, we have hundreds of SaaS products. And
Mm.
traditionally, those would have been line of business applications that were built in house, right? But then, like companies, like I said before, the management figured out we're not in that business. Stop building this stuff.
Yeah.
So like
Yeah.
this happens over and over and over again. So, but you know, the way you win this debate is to have a product so good that you could sell it to management and they will agree with you.
Yeah.
But like the way they need to frame it is like, Mr. CEO, I realize you're a software engineer. I realize that you started this company, you know what you're doing, but like the way you need to frame this problem is in 6 months, you will be allowing non-technical analysts to make decisions based on data in real time with no engineers in the middle. That's how you have to, this is what you need to understand. That is the goal. Okay. That's where you want to get to. You don't want to get to a point where your feedback loop is every time I ask a new question, I need data science to go build a new model. Because number one, all the ML and AI researchers work at Google. They don't work for you and they're not going to work for you. And number two, that is an incredibly slow feedback loop, right? That's a feedback loop that is guaranteed to fail you because the world is too dynamic to deal with those problems in that sort of a delayed decision-making process. So like that's really how they're going to have to get through to the CEOs at startups. I think they're already doing a good job of getting through the CEOs at larger companies. And I think Alex Karp's been a big part of that. But this is
Mhm.
also like if Alex Karp got on the phone just via a Zoom call with the CTOs and CEOs, I think that would carry a lot of weight, to like sell this idea I'm talking about, because I don't know if they're going to believe people who have limited experience in the field, and so that could be a really powerful thing to their advantage as well. But I think if they do a good job too of like picking their customers, you're gonna have an organic growth cycle at some point, because if their customers are quality and they actually produce good outcomes over time and they're successful, they'll essentially, like I said, create their own market. Foundry will become the best practice that is used by successful companies. And eventually the engineers are just going to be clamoring to get their hands on that, as opposed to failing again. So, yeah.
Gotcha. All right, just a few things to wrap up. So you had mentioned the developer community
Yeah.
as the idea as certainly something that should happen in the future. Do you think the certification program is a step towards that, or not really?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's a really good step in the right direction. It's a great beta test too, because like I do this at my company, right? Like we build boot camps and training programs to teach engineers how we want them to build software, right? And we generally beta test them on small teams that are sort of purpose built around the boot camp, and we can figure out what works and what doesn't work, right? And find holes in the process and where we need better documentation, maybe more on demand training to bolster the in person training, that sort of thing. So I think it's a great beta test for them. It's good they're starting with existing customers because they can see the value add right away. Like where did the training pay off in actual real world usage, right? And that way they can drive outcomes, so they're not like if you design a training program without an outcome in mind and you're just documenting stuff, like there's no clear way in which to apply that knowledge, right? So like you build training programs to enable outcomes first, and then you figure out the material that's going to go in there. Again, that's like working backwards from where you want to be to define the problem. So I think it's a really good decision, but they can't sleep on this too long. Like nothing's certain, nothing says that Foundry does become the best practice solution everyone wants to use. It could be that C3 AI becomes that system. So they don't have an infinite time window here, and I think that in a lot of ways their overconfidence might become a weakness if they don't realize that quick. And software companies live and die by the developer experience. Like every single company out there knows this. Like Apple invested heavily when iOS was released to train engineers on how to use the platform and what the revenue sharing models were, what tools they needed, and how to set up their environments. Like Adobe did the exact same thing. Like when when Flash was around, they were doing something similar. Companies realize that without a thriving developer community, you're done. I mean, that's why it's a key metric in crypto projects. How many developers work on the project? If there aren't any developers working on it, I don't want to waste my time. So
Yeah.
like, so again, this is a key component to success in the software business generally. And if you're too overconfident that your stuff is just that good, someone else will build that community and you'll just be out because developers don't like to switch. So like once there's a high switching cost for them, once they've invested in getting their environments set up to work on that platform, they don't want to go adopt another one. So they do need to realize that there is a serious problem if they don't execute on that at some point.
One thing you've mentioned a couple times now is this idea of the failure rate.
Yep.
Now,
Yep.
Palantir hasn't really shared a lot of the data or statistics here behind their own platform, and I think that could definitely be useful. Now, they've got to be, of course, cognizant and careful of sensitive information on these
Yep.
projects that they're working on, but I think I would certainly like Palantir to be sharing more high-level data and information on how successful they are to sort of keep themselves accountable, but to
Yep.
also, of course, leverage that. And if they are the best in the industry at certain things, then why not? Why not put it on the website or whatever? What do you think
Yeah, I
about
think
that?
they definitely need to bolster that case for sure. I mean, we can infer just based on the fact that customers are re-upping on the platform that it's probably enabling quite a few positive outcomes. We don't know to the extent, especially in the startup space, like how successful outcome, like how many successful outcomes they're enabling. I don't know if I would use the failure rate of the startup as the metric, because the only thing that has a higher failure rate than ML and AI initiatives are startups generally. They have a
Yeah,
9 in 10 failure rate. So tech startups fail at a 90% rate. This is part of my key pitch to management when I come into a company, is explain to them the failure rates of startups and what you need to do to not fail. But like, anyway, so I mean, the startup business, Foundry for Builders, trying to point to that. I don't know how much of a winning scenario that is unless they can get deep into the weeds about like where the initiatives are successful. But I think in a large part, focusing too much on the startups is just bad because they have a 9 in 10 failure rate generally. So it's like most of those
gotcha.
companies are going to go out of business. I think focusing on the enterprise space is where that makes the most sense, and the global 2000 and where they're enabling good outcomes for those people. Um, the real proof, I think, will be like the success of those publicly traded companies that use Foundry and their competition and how they're out competing their competitors using Foundry. That's where the proof is in the pudding. There's no other explanation for that other than Foundry is just that good. Um, how they get that message out there, I'm not 100% sure on. I don't like the fluff videos that much. Like everyone has a fluff video. It's like, all right, great. Like you did this thing in tech or you did this thing over here. It's like, no, no, no. Show me like the financials. Like, show me a number on an income statement that got bigger because of your stuff. Like, that's
Yeah.
more impactful to me, at least. So that's
Yeah,
what I'd
they
like.
have the Impact website, or I forget if it's still live. I think it is.
Yep.
Palantir.com/impact or impact.palantir.com, something like that. And they did sort of start to do this where they explain this is what we are impacting and this is the result of Foundry in this specific part of the organization, be that time or monetary effect or just something else. I think, yeah, they started to do that, which was definitely helpful to get a sense of here's the direct impact that we've been able to realize. But
Yep.
I think that should be their entire marketing effort,
Yeah. Pretty
to do
much. That's
something
what
like
I would do. Yeah.
instead of
That would
something
be
that,
my focus for
yeah,
sure.
harder to find. But I like this idea of, and we can just close on this idea of the public proof that's
Yep.
really going to carry Palantir and make it the company that we all hope it can become. I also like taking a step back, the idea of picking the customers so that these strategic partnerships are as successful as they can be, which will
Yep.
then create organic growth beyond that, and then public proof even further. But just in terms of a timeline, we've already seen success, obviously, in
Yep.
the commercial space and many companies that are benefiting from Foundry. But is there a certain point at which you're expecting more of this public proof to become evident? Like, is that years
Yeah.
down the road, or
Years. Yeah. 2026 would be my projected year. And that just gives everyone enough time to fail with their current solutions. Like they're 2 or 3 years out from building those. And then also that it just takes time to build developer communities, developer advocates, and establish that best practice. And that's usually a few years of effort. So to me, 2026 would be the year where you probably see the inflection point reached and their customer count go from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands, right? So like, and things generally in technology happen that way. Like Carp's totally right. Like everything in technology is nonlinear, right? Like don't ever expect a linear growth curve from any tech company. I don't care if they say their guidance is 30% year over year. No tech company produces that, right? There is no tech company you look at that goes 30% year over year for 5 years or whatever. No, that's just not how they grow typically, especially when they're at the start of the growth phase. I'm not saying the stock price is going to do that. What I'm saying is like they just don't grow that way. So 2026 would be my year where I would say we've reached the inflection point, and they're going to grow from hundreds of customers to thousands and maybe even to tens of thousands in the following year. That would be like sort of the model I have in mind. But there's a lot of things they're going to have to do leading up to that. And one of the things is, again, establishing this developer community and providing open source tools and training so people can get used to using Foundry. And they're going to have to do that early. Like, I don't think they can hold on that past 2023. Like in 2024, if they don't have that, like I may have to reevaluate my thesis on whether or not this company is going to achieve what they think that I think they can achieve. So I kind of have a rough timeline in mind. I don't want to get too bogged down in it, because again, it's fluid. Like you may have a model in your mind, a sort of mental map of like how this is all going to play out, right? But like reality gets a vote, so like things happen, so you got to stay on top of like what's actually playing out in the real world, because that could drive adoption too. We go to war tomorrow. I have a strong suspicion Palantir is going to be getting a lot more government contracts to both secure networks and to help analysts make better decisions based on intelligence. The intelligence apparatus generally is going to expand in a world that's either in a cold war or a hot war. So that's an example of like reality gets a vote, but reality also gets a vote that maybe C3 AI builds a thriving developer community and puts Palantir out of business because they slept on that. So not that I think that's a good product. I don't particularly think it is, but my point is that this is a battle, and in battles things shape out based on the enemy gets a vote. It's not just your plan that and your vision that's going to play out.
And thank you for sharing that idea on the sort of, I guess it's 4 years now, 2026. Yep. But leading up to that, we've got the earnings call and earnings report in a couple weeks now. Is there anything you look for? I'm sure you observe the quarterly, and I mean you're obviously in all the news, but is there any specific items you look for in an earnings report, quarterly earnings report, that you say, hey, this needs to be better, or this looks good? Or are you just saying, my thesis is in some number of years, the inflection point will occur and we'll see if that happens? Like, I'm just trying to see, are you monitoring it more frequently than a multi-year basis?
All right. So there is a lot to unpack in this question. So let's take two key parts of it. First is Daniel Kahneman's work on illusions of success and regression to the mean, and the ability for people to predict stocks and growth. He did research that basically showed the accounts for any hedge fund that he went to, the most successful accounts were the ones that had the fewest trades over the long haul, right? So like he basically said, no, you can't figure this out. This, statistically speaking, you're just engaged in like, a sort of delusion, a mass delusion, basically. So his work is in part of the way I approach these problems, and not concerning myself too much with technical analysis, because I don't believe if you're in an investment out past a few days, that there's really anything valuable you're going to pick out of this. So like, just things happen. The world is dynamic. But the other part of it is, I think there's this like question is like, what are you basing your growth projections on if you're not basing them on technical analysis and the numbers, and like, where are you getting these ideas? I'm operating from a standpoint that no one can predict the next Amazon. Like, who would have thought that a bookseller would become the world's largest chipset manufacturer or switch manufacturer, or the world's biggest infrastructure company with transatlantic cables? Who the hell predicted that? Did anyone predict that? I don't think anyone predicted that. I don't think Amazon thought it would be doing that back in the day, right? The point is that I invest in leadership teams, and I invest in what looks like an engineering culture that can make the next 0 to 1 move. That's really where I approach my investment thesis when it comes to technology, because I know that those people will produce these outcomes that are just unfathomable. Like you can't really know what these companies are capable of doing. It's that flywheel effect you talked about, right? So like that term flywheel, by the way, that's used heavily in the tech industry. It's the subject of a book called Play Bigger, where they talk about the flywheel and how they spin the flywheel of innovation. The point of that is like nobody knows what the end product is going to be. They just know they have some really innovative people who figured out how to build software at scale, and how they eventually land is anyone's guess, right? So again, just use Amazon as a model to realize that like you can't predict. If you're like, for me, when I'm looking for that 0 to 1 tech company, I'm investing in the people and the processes and the foundation. I don't really know what the outcome's going to be, but I know that it's going to be big. Right? So like
Yeah.
that's sort of what drives my thesis, because I've seen it so much, and being at startups for so long, you tend to know what to look for, and what you see is like, oh, they're gonna do some things that no one's thought of before, for sure.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for this hour, 20-minute conversation, and sharing your time with me. This was awesome.
Absolutely, man.
Many different.
Thank you for having me on, and keep up the awesome work. And
Thank
yeah,
you.
man, I just super stoked to be on the show for sure.
Yeah. Amazing. All right.
Awesome,
Thank
man.
you, CodeStrap.